Hi everyone, we're getting to the big boys now. We're going to talk about Jupiter, the second ray sacred planet in our solar system, responsible for expansion, optimism, travel, education. It's the guru, learning, joyful attitude, abundance, all of these good things associated with Jupiter, and esoterically having a lot to do with the expansion of the soul life and the spiritual attitude. As a second ray entity, it has a strong indication of the overall spiritual purpose and contribution that the individual makes in the life. When we look at the natal chart, the rising sign's more that specific purpose, and it's a little bit more individualized, but Jupiter in the chart actually shows, when we look at the life as a whole, if it's expressing esoterically, where is that greatest contribution going to be made in that general overarching sense. And that makes sense, of course, because it is a second ray planet and we live in a second ray solar system. So the love wisdom principle being this somewhat of a core point of expression and articulation when we consider the spiritual life as a whole. So stay tuned to keep learning about Jupiter in esoteric astrology. Let's first consider Jupiter in its traditional Orthodox and exoteric expressions. There are many. It rules exoterically Pisces and Sagittarius, two mutable signs, with the other two mutable signs being ruled by Mercury. So here is an important point about the mutable cross. We say in general, for average humanity expressing only on the mutable cross, these strongest planetary forces that indicate the nature of human expression are Jupiter and Mercury, being the planetary rulers of the mutable signs. So at this level, we're seeing the general propensity towards expansion and accumulation. That's Jupiter, right? With experience, gaining experience here and there. So from an unconscious or a completely, let's say, spiritually non-responsive angle, we can just see the blind kind of absorption that happens with Jupiter. And when we see exoteric expressions of Jupiter when looking at a chart, it will tend to show this, and this is Jupiter expressing through the lower three worlds of the Maya, right? It will show a tendency towards excess or accumulation, or an inflated, overabundant, optimistic attitude that's maybe not actually grounded in reality. This can be especially the case with Sagittarius sometimes, or if we have any prominent squares or hard aspects to personal planets with Jupiter in the chart, it can show a sort of it's off ground. And we've spoken about this with Sagittarius, right, where exoterically it can sometimes be optimistic and away from what's really practical and grounded. And of course Sagittarius becomes a very practical and very grounded sign esoterically when the earth starts moving through it, which is its esoteric ruler. So Jupiter, and of course in the Piscean way, it's the blind enmeshment with experience in that way. The way in which Pisces can merge or blend with its environment, something like that. Now, when the human being starts responding to more spiritual impulses, still on the mutable cross, then we're seeing the slight urge towards a greater life, and there's the optimistic or the learning aspect of Jupiter coming into play. So now we're educating, we're gaining experiences, but with a little bit more consciousness, with the urge towards understanding more. It's a second ray planet, love, wisdom, and all of these good things. And then with Mercury there, in terms of coming back to the mutable cross expression, Mercury is harmony through conflict. So that speaks to, on the mutable cross, action, reaction, cause and effect at the lowest level, unconsciously in situations of conflict, unable to really ascertain why. And then when we're evolving on the mutable cross, starting to oh, action, reaction, cause and effect. Okay, what's going on here, and starting to make those steps. So as a general statement on the mutable cross with Mercury and Jupiter there, we say something like, harmony through conflict and love wisdom. These are the lines of least resistance for the evolution of humanity. And when those Mercurial and Jupiterian forces start to move with a little bit more response to the soul or with a spiritual ideal, then we start to have the progression, treading the probationary path, as it were, heading up to eventually a point of some sort of crisis that begins that switch to the fixed cross energies, okay? But Jupiter at that level, expansion, blind fusion, enmeshment, evolving into education, learning, aspiration, moving out of, let's say, Piscean negativity at its lowest level into a kind of optimism or an urge towards love and unity in that way. Coming back to Jupiter on the mutable cross, starting at blind enmeshment and merging with the environment and experience in an undifferentiated way, working with and starting to respond to the mercurial energies of discrimination and investigation, and then becoming, leading the average unawakened man to the line of expansion, of education, moving out of Piscean negativity at its lowest level into optimism and an urge towards truth or understanding or learning. Jupiter sometimes exoterically has been associated with truth and justice as well. The principle of the logos or the spirit, to whatever degree we consider Jupiter as that higher father principle in that sense. Yeah, it's interesting to consider Jupiter from that angle of exoteric only. In traditional astrology, it's typically always considered a benefic planet, wherever it sits in the chart. However, it can do some funny things. For instance, there are plenty of examples of individuals with Jupiter in the 7th house, typically of marriage, partnership. So we might say that person's going to do really well in that field of marriages. But there are some cases where the individual in question, we see 7, 8, 9, 10 marriages in the life. So even though there's an expansion and a big yes from Jupiter, it's from one level we might say, well, maybe that's actually not very lucky if you're having so many marriages. Surely the ideal marriage would be sticking with that transcendent love principle and having that be reflected in a partnership that stays, and it's just one partnership. So that tendency towards excess or the blind expansiveness, as we mentioned, when it's purely expressing through the Maya and unconscious mutability and point of identification, where there isn't necessarily that urge towards growth or an indwelling transcendent principle, which would be the average person beginning to respond to a more spiritual life, something like that. When Jupiter starts acting in an esoteric way, where its true function is starting to impress itself upon the life, Jupiterian transits become quite interesting. They're certainly very interesting or active when it comes to the 2nd degree initiation, or where there's a lot of astral purification going on. It can actually be quite a healing planet in this case, and there's a hint there at its hierarchical rulership of Virgo, which we'll come to shortly. I myself have observed Jupiter going through places where, yes, overall it's bringing a benefic quality, but the transit itself has been somewhat unpleasant because it's bringing healing, unifying energies of that 2nd ray energy. And in that, it's picking up on and pushing out all of these places of disintegration or disharmony. So once again, we're seeing the angles of what really is positive or spiritually benefic versus from the angle of the personality. It can be a bit uncomfortable. So we watch out for Jupiter transits when we're considering the astral purification, or when there's a much deeper responsiveness to the soul, and it will still bring learning and unification in the chart, but in a way where it's really starting to push itself into the human form and bring about this synthesis of the form itself, hinting at Virgo once again. Let's jump right into then its rulerships at the esoteric and hierarchical levels. Jupiter esoterically rules Aquarius, which necessarily brings it into prime importance as we shift into the Aquarian age. Okay, we're seeing the hidden love principle moving through Aquarius as the sign connected to groups, group work, and larger group consciousness being a big part of the epoch that we're moving into, moving away from self-orientation or moving out of the Piscean way of that introversion into the Christ principle and elevating up through the sixth ray into that the mystical, that slightly more interior inner way of the mystical process, and moving out into Aquarius with the influence of Uranus there being very seventh ray, practical, organizing principles there, starting to move with many different moving parts of matter, of substance, including people and organizations. So that's Uranus there with Aquarius, and then that inner impulse overall is that desire towards unity, of education, of sharing the resources. That's a very Jupiterian key there. And Aquarius is, of course, the water bearer. Christ himself in the Bible makes a reference to Aquarius, the water bearer. He says to his disciples, follow the man with pitcher of water, and he will lead you into the kingdom, something like this. So right there, the hint at moving into group consciousness, moving into the greater ideal, the loving ideal of sharing the wisdom, connecting everyone together. We can already see these Jupiterian hints in terms of the exoteric expressions of some of our Aquarian impulses, such as the internet, technology, Uranus, and the greater global networking. Of course, we have the shadow of that, the World Wide Web being a slightly third ray quality, and there's the dark web, and also misinformation and the warping of the mental principle. It's said that whereas in the Piscean age, the battle was a little bit more on the astral plane, given the sixth ray quality moving through the Piscean age, bringing Neptune and Mars and the astral plane into this concentration there. We still have the astral problem necessarily as human beings, but its effect is showing up more on the mental plane now. So the reality of mind control or disinformation, misinformation, these are all some of the consequences, let's say, of moving into Aquarius with the technological pieces there. And of course, Aquarius is a fifth ray sign of mind and mentality as well. In any case, coming back to Jupiter, the best benefic effect, let's say, of internet is worldwide access to communication. People can connect all over the world. We can learn things in a way that we couldn't before. It completely has that blowing over of the Saturnian rule coming to the Uranian quality there. We don't really need to get educated in the same way anymore, with the exception of some professions which require very much that precise, long study Saturnian way, like being a lawyer or a scientist in some way, shape or form like that. But not everyone needs to go to university just as well, because universities are ridiculously expensive now, and all these problems to do with the educational space in terms of that stuff collectively. But people can self-learn and self-educate in a way that we couldn't before. We can learn and do things from home. This is all of these benefic qualities of technology and the potential for that Jupiterian influence there. One of the, it's not exactly the keynote, but it's like a point, a significant phrase for Aquarius is something like that DK mentions in the book. Aquarius lightens the burden of Virgo, meaning that in the sharing of the waters globally, getting education, information out, it helps elevate matter, substance, those parts of material existence which are stuck as a result of not having the waters of life being able to flow through them, opportunity, education, all of this stuff that comes with the Aquarian movement here. Now, that was almost a mini treatise on Aquarius there, but we're talking about Jupiter, and Jupiter is the esoteric ruler, so it brings these Jupiterian qualities. We can see the esoteric signification or activity of Jupiter at that global level when we see its rulership of Aquarius there. Hierarchically, Virgo. Virgo is the sign of healing, of synthesis, of wisdom, divine feminine wisdom. So interesting that Jupiter, typically a very masculine planet, at least psychologically or from that exoteric orthodox point of view, being inflated or above substance, as we can see sometimes with Sagittarius, for instance. Hierarchically, it's connected to this sign of deep substance and materiality. So here we have what we hinted at before with the synthesis of the forms, bringing unification, healing, Jupiter in the 6th house, even to whatever degree we consider the 6th house of healing, a Virgoic one, is a very benefic placement. I've seen some people with this house placement expressing a very esoteric chart, and they are quite profound wisdom keepers when it comes to the intelligence of form and the mystical underpinnings of how substance is to align itself and all of these sorts of good things. So the way in which the love principle is acting through the form, and it brings it back to Pisces as well, because Jupiter rules Pisces exoterically, and Pisces Virgo, the Christ and the substance, the mother principle. So the love principle imbuing itself so deeply into the form nature that it brings about this purification. And we do say that love purifies the system, right? So necessarily this urge towards loving consciousness, and particularly in its relationship to Virgo as the feminine principle, going so deep, the follow through of that love principle, whereas exoterically it can be the optimistic ideal, but it grounds itself into the form where it becomes this piecing together all of the bits and pieces. And we see a bit of that with Mercury, of course, where it's this thing, that thing, and that's the mercurial aspect in Virgo there, making it a very specific, well, even materialistic in some cases, but knowing how this bit relates to this bit, and then Jupiter at its highest possible level, bringing the consciousness principle into play there, the way in which consciousness brings matter or synthesizes matter. So this idea with Jupiter that love heals, consciousness heals, the soul as a second ray principle heals, okay? And we see that when we start looking at Jupiter, if the individual is second degree initiate or hovering around that point of development, Jupiter again revealing these places of great fusion and harmonizing, which can sometimes show up in this way of discomfort or unpleasantness in terms of having to align things up. If we think about in a really material way, when you break an arm and you have to put a cast on, and it's not necessarily comfortable, but it pieces it back together. So Jupiter has this slightly Virgoic quality in that sense when it's expressing in this way. But otherwise it still brings, even if it's not showing up in that degree of material synthesis, it in the chart will show areas of expansion of knowledge, of where the love and learning principle is most aligning itself in the life at that particular moment. When you look at the natal chart itself, look to the position and the placement of Jupiter in the chart, and that will show you where the overall contribution of the spiritual life will be made. And consider that in relationship to where Aquarius is, and even where Virgo is, but certainly Aquarius, and that the house position of Aquarius, that's going to show you pretty much where that sort of overall group contribution is going to be made, where the urge towards that sharing of the love principle of bearing the waters, the water bearer, where that's going to be made. So consider Aquarius, consider Jupiter at the house natal placement for the overall indication of where the life will be going, the spiritual life will be going, and what kind of contribution the soul is seeking to make as a whole.